Okay, hello everybody. Just give us a few minutes. We're going to get started and waited until everybody gets logged in. So we'll start in about a minute or so. Okay, we're just going to wait a couple seconds here to let everybody log into their program. So just give us about maybe 30 seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello to everybody out there. Thanks for joining us tonight on this fine Ohio evening. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Hudson Library. A couple quick little announcements, and then we'll go ahead and get right to the program. We have some programs you may be interested in. We have a virtual program on September 13th at 7 p.m., which is tomorrow. We're going to have Barbara Butcher, and she's going to talk about what the dead know, learning about life as a New York City death investigator. And we have a couple in-person programs as well. September 19th at 6:30 in person, we have environmentalist journalist Jeff Goodell, and he's the author of The Heat Will Kill You First, Life on a Scorched Planet. Now, since we're actually going to be talking about World War II, I thought I'd mention another World War II program. That's going to be October 19th, which is Thursday at 6:30 in person. We're going to have retired U.S. Army Major General Mary Elder, and she's going to talk about the girls who stepped out of line, the untold stories of the women who changed the course during World War II. So if you want to learn about any of those wonderful programs, go on to hudsonlibrary.org and sign up or check out some of the other programming. So we'd also like to thank our local bookseller, The Learned Owl. They're going to provide copies of the book. There's going to be a link, and you can buy a copy of this book here. So support our local booksellers. And thanks again to the Learned Owl. Also, we are going to have questions tonight. So we'll have at the very end of the program, and there's a little Q&A thing at the bottom you might see there. So go ahead, don't be shy. You can ask some questions. So speaking of our author, tonight we have with us from Massachusetts, James Conroy, and he's going to be talking about this book here, The Devils Will Get No Rest. He's written a number of books as well. Jefferson's White House, Monticello and the Potomac, One Common Country, Abraham Lincoln and the Hamptons Roads Peace Conference of 1865, as well as another Lincoln book, The Lincoln White House, The People's House in Wartime, and also one that was routinely called the prestigious Gilda Lehrman Lincoln Prize. He's a graduate of the University of Connecticut, graduated also from Georgetown University Law Center, and practiced law in Boston. He's an honorary fellow of Massachusetts Historical Society, worked on Capitol Hill as a Senate press secretary and congressman's chief of staff, and served for 6 years in the Naval Air Reserve. So with that, I'll turn it over to the author.
Well, thank you, Derek, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. Zoom presentations are a little different, of course, from in person. I don't get to see you and get a feel for what you're thinking, what you're interested in or not, but we'll forge ahead and hope for the best. So yeah, the title of the book is up on the screen, and we'll talk about the title as we go. But the topic of the book is something called the Casablanca Conference of January 1943, at which Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and their combined military high command met in Casablanca, Morocco, for 10 days in an active war zone for the purpose of planning the offensive stage of the war. Up until late 1942, the war had been going almost completely the Axis way. The British were fighting alone for quite a long part of the preceding few years, and as we'll see, the balance of power, if you will, was such that the Allies, the British and the Americans and the Russians on the other end, were finally beginning to put offensive pressure on the Germans. And this meeting was called for the purpose of planning that stage of this war. And the interactions of the great characters involved here, I think I can safely say, is really the focal point of the book. It's quite a character-driven book. Next, please. Derek was kind enough to mention Lincoln's White House. I don't have Oprah's endorsement yet, but I did get the honor of having another distinguished visitor to take a look at the book, and I thought somebody in the crowd might be interested in that. Next, please. So here we have a photograph taken at the Casablanca Conference that I think is a good spot to begin this presentation. Of course, we have Franklin Roosevelt on the left, seated in front, and Churchill on his left. And behind them, behind Roosevelt in particular, are the three American Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. We'll talk about each of them in due course. And behind Churchill are the three British Chiefs of Staff. The point to be kept in mind with regard to this combined high command is that it truly was combined. At Marshall's insistence, General George C. Marshall's insistence, back in early 42, the British had agreed that all of the military strategic decisions made by the Allied forces under Anglo-American command would be made jointly by this group you see here. And they would direct all of the military activity in the war on the Anglo-American side as if it were one combined force. So it was very important to Allied cohesion that held together. And it was also very important that the decisions that were made at this conference would be heartily accepted by both ends of the alliance and put into effect in a coordinated, efficient way. So this was going to be a critical meeting, not only for the purpose of deciding on a strategy, but finding a way to get there that would leave everyone reasonably satisfied. Because as we will see, there were great divisions, differences, and suspicions even among the British and Americans at this time. It's a character-driven book. There are plenty of books out there that will tell you the dates of battles and how many soldiers fought on both sides and what the casualties were and how many landing craft were manufactured that year. You know, that kind of thing is elsewhere and can also be looked up very easily. This book, as all of my books, I hope, is focused on the personalities, the individuals involved in these great decisions, what they thought of each other, how they got along, how they resolved their differences, and how that human factor of personality and character took them through this very momentous 10-day event. Briefly, I'll say, as a bit of an orientation on the question of how the British and Americans thought of each other collectively, which is important. To start with, the Americans were obviously accomplished, successful men who had reached the top of a very difficult profession, but the Americans had not been active to any very large extent between the wars and world affairs. American officers at the time were not really trained in diplomacy or in interaction with foreign players or with foreign policy for that matter, and really had played up till this point next to no role at all in the European war, and had certainly been fighting in the Pacific heavily, but the British really were the dominant force in the European war. In addition to that difference, the British had been a major world power for 300 years, whereas the Americans really had never been the kind of world power that Britain, France, Russia, Germany were and had been, Japan, and others. So we've got a kind of an imbalance of experience and sophistication and military orientation, if you will, to go along with some strong cultural differences, political differences, at least as deeply rooted as the, if you want to call it, the red and blue state differences are today. So it was a bit of a challenge, and it unwound itself in, I think, an interesting way. Next slide, please. This will orient us, hopefully, to the situation that prevailed militarily at the time the conference was held in January of 43. And I think if one word were to be used to describe it, it would be terrifying. To start with the Pacific Theater on the right side of the screen, you can see Japan in black, and also in black, the entirety of the Korean Peninsula, and below that to the southwest, Taiwan. That is because Japan had already annexed Korea and Taiwan early in the century. So really they were part of Japan proper at that time. In addition to that, the gray shaded areas are the territories that the Japanese had conquered, occupied, and controlled by the time of this conference. So the bottom line there is they dominate, completely control most of Eastern Asia, most of Southeast Asia, and essentially all of the Southwest Pacific. The Americans had stopped their offensive capabilities at the Battle of Midway a few months before the conference, but the Japanese were still a very formidable military force, dug in very deeply and strongly in all of these places, and a long way from beaten. Shifting over to the left side of the screen is the truly appalling situation that the Allies were in at this time. Again, in black is Germany, Austria, the German Reich, as it's called, with the combined German, Austrian, and other German-speaking areas in Central Europe. And then below them, of course, Italy, the other big European Axis power. And in dark gray around that, we see the areas that had been conquered and occupied and controlled by the Germans since the start of the war, and the Italians. And in light gray, we've got what is generally described as neutral countries, politically, officially neutral. But even almost all of those countries, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, and to some degree Turkey, were really pro-German and had been co-opted by the Germans, providing them steel and finances and other raw materials and all kinds of other assistance. So what you're left with when you look at that map on the left is almost complete Nazi domination of Western Europe. The other point to keep in mind here is that the Americans, together with the British, had conducted a successful invasion of North Africa a few months before this meeting. So the area between Morocco in the far western part of the North African region, all the way over to Tunisia, which is in dark gray there, was now controlled by the Anglo-Americans. There was still fighting in Tunisia that was largely German controlled, but with advances being made by the Allies. So the point to keep in mind on all of that is that there's a very strong Anglo-American army in North Africa ready to be used in this next offensive stage of the war. And the question is, where are they going to be used and how? Next, please. Joseph Stalin was not at this conference at Casablanca, officially because the Battle of Stalingrad was going on at that time in January of 43, and commanded, of course, almost all, if not all, of Stalin's attention. The other reason that historians collectively point to is Stalin's paranoia, no doubt justified, about the fear of assassination or a coup that might put him out of power. So he was reluctant to leave the Kremlin really at any time during the war. Next, please. This is probably the most famous portrait of Winston Churchill that ever has been taken, and is sort of the iconic one that's used in books and the like about him. The point to keep in mind fundamentally with Churchill in this context is that, of course, he was a genius in terms of political leadership, courage, moral leadership of his country, without which it's very doubtful that the British could have survived up until this point of January 43. Nobody will ever take that away from Churchill. In addition to that, he was very steeped in military affairs. He had graduated from Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, served in the British Army in 3 different wars, had written 24 works of military history, starting in 1890. So Churchill, in addition to that, had been First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy in the First World War, and at a later point in that war, Secretary of State for War. So here is a leader not only with the eloquence and the moral suasion that he had, but also with great depth of military knowledge and experience. Next, please. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had never been in the military himself, and did not have the same level of strategic military expertise and knowledge that Churchill had. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy throughout the First World War, and had gained a great deal of knowledge in that capacity, almost exclusively about the Navy as opposed to the Army, and had developed a very strong affinity for the Navy in that role. But he had not been a scholar of military affairs or a strategist or have anything like the depth that Churchill had in military affairs. What he did have was an uncanny ability to choose leaders in fields that he did not have expertise in, the military being one. He had learned a lot and he knew a lot and he had studied a lot, but he just didn't have the depth or the expertise that these folks had. But in addition to be able to choose good people for those roles, he had an uncanny political judgment, just a master politician, knew how to deal with people, how to charm people, how to frankly manipulate people, including Churchill often, to get where he wanted to be. Now, it was his idea to have this conference for the purposes I've described and invited Churchill and Stalin. Of course, Stalin declined, but Churchill agreed. All of this was in great secrecy. The Casablanca area was chosen because that great Anglo-American army was in the vicinity and its leaders were handy to be conferred with and participate in this conference. And also because it was relatively proximate for the British to get there and not as cumbersome for the Americans to get there as it might have been, in some other more distant area. The night before the conference took place, which was again top secret, nobody knew he was going. I should say not before the conference took place, but before he left for the conference. He and Eleanor had a dinner party at the White House on New Year's Eve and planted a joke, as FDR liked to do, that could not be fully appreciated for months to come, or at least certainly for weeks to come, by showing a movie after the dinner. Next slide, please. Casablanca itself, which had just been released with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. So there is a bit of a tweak in the psychic curtain here that the American people were, enthralled by this great movie called Casablanca, just as the conference was launched. Next, please. So now we're going to go through briefly each of the key players on the British and American teams. Here, we begin with General George C. Marshall, probably more famous for his role after the war in leading the famous Marshall Plan to rehabilitate Europe from the damage that had been done there during the war, which he did under Truman's presidency. But at the time of the conference, Marshall was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army and a very formidable character with a strength of personality and a depth of character that everyone who dealt with him remarks about. Just the kind of a man who took command of a room by walking into it. I think you can see that on his face. I love these images in part because, as the cliche goes, you can tell a lot more from a picture than you can from a lot of words. Marshall was highly respected, both by the Americans and by the British, but did not, again, have that kind of military strategic expertise that the British tended to have. Marshall was a great logician and a great tactician and a terrific organizer of armies, but he was not a deep strategic thinker or steeped nearly as much in the fine points of military strategy as many of the British were. Next, please. Here's I think a good emblem of the personalities of Eisenhower on the left there, a Marshall protege, and we'll get to him too, and Marshall on the right. They're making a tour of an American base, and you can see there Ike is running for mayor, and Marshall looks like his dog just died. So I think that gives you a sense of the personalities and character of the two men. Next, please. In charge of the U.S. Navy at the time as Chief of Naval Operations was Admiral Ernest J. King, another very formidable figure in a very different way. I write in the book that the United States Navy was both blessed and cursed by the leadership of Admiral King throughout the Second World War. Blessed because King was without peer as a naval strategist. He understood it and had studied it exhaustively and really impressed both friend and foe with his great command of naval strategy. The cursed end of it is the personality and character of King. Really the most despised senior officer in the American military, I think it's safe to say, with the possible exception of MacArthur. But King was petty beyond belief, abusive to subordinates and peers, incredibly selfish and self-promoting, difficult, not a well-liked man, to say the least. At one point, Eisenhower, who was then just a brigadier general, wrote in his diary, one of the best ways to win this war might be to get somebody to shoot King. So that gives you some idea of what King was like. A fellow admiral said after the war that King wouldn't give you the time of day. He would sell you the time of day, but he wouldn't give it to you. Next, please. So the third big American player is General Henry Arnold, otherwise known as Hap Arnold, which you can perhaps tell on the face of this photograph as well. Genial, personable guy, but also a very demanding authoritarian figure as well, which is, I think, is an unusual mix. He had built the U.S. Air Force from nothing into a very formidable force even before the war broke out, and continued to be the key player on the American aviation side. Next, please. Here, just for the sake of interest, is an early photo of Hap Arnold as a young Army lieutenant at the first batch of aviators in the U.S. Army, of which there were 24, and 18 of those 24 were killed in plane crashes within a very short time. You can see these airplanes at the time were really bicycles on wings, as I like to say. And if anybody ever challenged Arnold's credentials as a military aviator's pioneer, he had a drop-dead answer. The Wright brothers had taught him to fly. Next, please. So coming now to the British side, we have, first of all, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British Army, General Alan Brooke, General Sir Alan Brooke, I should say, the youngest son of an Anglo-Irish baronet. Brooke was 56 years old, with a surgical mind, an effortless air of command, and the stare of a bird of prey. Again, a photograph, I think, can tell volumes. This was a very dominant figure, a slight man, not physically imposing, but brilliant, very, very stubborn, obstinate, took command and held it, and was not easily persuaded away from any of his positions. One of his subordinates nicknamed him Colonel Shrapnel, which quickly took hold surreptitiously on both sides of the Atlantic. Brooke, by the way, had been a tremendously important figure in saving the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, fighting his way at the head of a corps of that formation 40 miles from where the Germans had attacked to the evacuation point at Dunkirk, pretty much all but surrounded by hugely superior German forces, and somehow managed to lead that British detachment to safety at Dunkirk, which really no doubt saved the British from defeat in the war very early on. Next, please. There was another side to Brooke, and I show this little drawing he made for his children to illustrate that point. He was a talented sketch artist. He did pictures like this for his children and beautifully illustrated letters to his mother. In addition to that, he was a world-class ornithologist and an internationally recognized bird photographer. So this is a complicated guy with several sides to his personality. Next, please. Here's a photograph of Brooke with Churchill on the deck of a British destroyer soon after the invasion of France in June of 1944. And I show it to you to illustrate their bond. They were, Brooke reported directly to Churchill. The British chiefs of staff met with Churchill almost every day, sometimes twice a day. And there was a very contentious relationship between Brooke and Churchill, two strong-willed men, often clashing in their own conference room before they ever got to the American side. Next, please. Finally, on the big three on the British side, we've got Admiral Dudley Pound, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who had joined the Royal Navy at the age of 13 in 1890, and really contributed almost nothing to the conversation except on naval issues. But in that sphere, Admiral Pound was widely respected and admired on both sides of the table. So he's a key player as well. Next, please. I shouldn't have said finally on the big three, because this is the third of the big three. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, who was in command of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, at the really rather tender age of 49, to be in command of such an important, really crucial element of the British military. Portal was a true British aristocrat, educated at Winchester and Oxford, came from a very prominent, wealthy, landed family, but was as sensible and reasonable, as well as bright a man as you'd want to encounter. Very well regarded, again, on both sides of the table, liked and trusted by the Americans. Churchill once said, despite his gentlemanly qualities, that Portal could be a tough player. He berated me like a pickpocket in front of the American ambassador. Next, please. Finally, on the British side, we have Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was probably known to most of the participants here this evening, tragically in part because of his death at the hands of the IRA in his old age in the 1970s. But at the time of the conference, he was an admiral in the Royal Navy, very close to Churchill, a cousin of the king, a great-grandchild of Queen Victoria. So really at the top level of British society, but also very well-liked, very unpretentious, affable, pleasant kind of man, as I think you can see in that picture. Everybody on the American side was charmed by him, liked him, and found him to be just the kind of fellow that made a good match for the American temperament. Next, please. I'd like to show this quick picture of the group that was taken at Casablanca just after Mountbatten was told maybe he shouldn't be in the picture because he wasn't really one of the three commanders at the head of a service. But Churchill wanted a minute, so he got in the picture, and you can see him kind of squinting down there at the end to try to look smaller than the rest in his typical joking fashion. Next, please. So the conference took place again in Casablanca in a very wealthy enclave on the outskirts of the city called Anfa. At the building you see here before you, the Anfa Hotel, which was built in the late 1930s in what was called the streamlined modern style, kind of an Art Deco element, looks like a ship at sea almost. The conference took place in the bow-shaped room on the ground floor level there. All of the officers were lodged in the hotel, British and American, and became closer than they had ever been before. They had met twice before in Washington and London, but they had never been together for 10 days in this under the same roof as they were at ANFA, eating together, drinking together, sitting around in each other's rooms like college freshmen, forming friendships, getting to know each other, and developing the kind of personal rapport that made it possible to bridge a lot of differences. Next, please. Here's an aerial view of that hotel off to the left of the wing. And around it, you can see some of the 14 quite luxurious private villas that had been built in a kind of a circle around that hotel. They were all commandeered by the occupying forces to house FDR and Churchill and other dignitaries. And next slide, please. This is a diagram that I found in the papers of a junior officer, a couple of junior officers actually, that was issued to them at Casablanca. And you can see that diagram of the hotel in the middle, the villas that surround it, and also the red indicated barbed wire defenses that were erected completely around that whole affair, with fortified barbed wire fence, supplemented by anti-aircraft guns and tanks, and elite British and American troops who guarded the whole affair while it took place. Next, please. General George S. Patton Jr. Is well known to most, if not all of us, in the center of this picture. He commanded the American forces that had taken Casablanca a few months earlier and had taken the ANFA Hotel as his headquarters and many of the villas as well, including one for himself, which just by coincidence happened to be the most luxurious of them all. He kept a diary during the conference. He was not a participant in the conference. He was there to provide security and entertain the officers at dinner and the rest, but kept on a running commentary with all of these high-level participants that is really quite human, and I think personalizes the whole thing quite a bit. Next, please. This is a shot of the villa that was assigned to FDR, quickly called, of course, the Moroccan White House. And it's really quite a lovely 1930s style Art Deco Moroccan modern villa where Churchill visited every day, dined, ate lunch with FDR almost every time. And the two of them would meet separately there on military, diplomatic, political issues, while the military commanders were hashing out their strategy in the hotel. Next, please. There was an element of kind of a cruise almost mixed in with the business, which was deadly serious, but the weather was great. Everybody was coming in January from a colder climate, from a war-torn London where food was rationed and the weather was glum and it was not a pleasant place to be. So this kind of gives you a sense of the tone of relaxation and almost R&R that pervaded the conference. Roosevelt sitting on the patio of his villa with his top aide, Harry Hopkins, and also with two of his sons, both of them in the military. On the left, Elliott Roosevelt, an Air Corps pilot, decorated for daring photographic aviation over enemy ground. And at the end of the table, Franklin Roosevelt Jr., a naval officer, also decorated in combat in the battle for Casablanca, at which the Americans and the British had taken most of North Africa. Next, please. Harold Macmillan was a future prime minister of Great Britain, at the time a junior diplomat on the British side, brought to Casablanca to help wrangle the French, which we'll talk briefly about before we're done. Macmillan is a very witty, entertaining writer and kept a diary and letters to his wife, which feature prominently in the book. At one point, he talked about the terrifying procedure to get to the Moroccan White House, surrounded by Secret Service that Macmillan described as looking like retired Chicago gangsters. I thought that was a little harsh until I saw the next photograph, which I came across in the files of that Secret Service detail. And I think we can forgive Macmillan for suggesting that they look like Chicago gangsters. Next, please. So here we have the conference table with the military conferees at the Anfa Hotel doing their discussion and debate. On the left side of the table is the American team. On the right side, the British team. And it was a hotel banquet hall, actually, that was converted into a conference room for the occasion. The table is really quite narrow. And anybody who's been in such a meeting will know that it makes it all the more challenging to have a productive, genial meeting on a difficult subject when you're breathing down each other's necks as they are here. But the basic points that they faced in those 10 days are too lengthy and complicated to deal with briefly here, but we do need to know the two basic issues that they were hashing out. Next slide, please. So back to the maps, issue number one was we've got two wars basically that we're fighting on opposite ends of the world with limited resources to go around. So issue one is how much of those resources is going to go to the Pacific and how much to Europe. The Americans wanted a very big, full-scale aggressive war in the Pacific. The British wanted nothing more than a holding action there, a defensive, keep them where they are kind of a strategy with minimal cost and resources until Hitler was defeated in Europe. And you can see the wisdom of that. You know, for the British point of view, the Japanese were on the other side of the globe. The Germans were 22 miles across the channel and a deadly threat to the very existence of Britain. So that was issue number one. Issue number two is with regard to Europe, are we going to either attack the Germans across the English Channel, hitting them in those dug-in, concrete, fortified, barbed wire fortifications with battle-hardened, very tough defenders where they're really strongest of anywhere in Europe, or, by the way, that was the American approach. We want to cross that channel as quickly as we can and hit them as hard as we can, as early as we can, and then drive all the way to Berlin. The British approach was to come up instead through the Mediterranean with that Anglo-American army already in North Africa, within easy striking distance of pretty much anywhere in the Mediterranean. And further, the Germans would know that the Allies were massing their forces and landing craft and such for an assault in the Mediterranean, but they wouldn't know where it was going to come. Would it come in southern France or Sicily or Sardinia or Italy or Greece, the Balkans? Very hard to know. And this would in turn force the Germans to dilute their forces, spread them out thinly to all of these points around the Mediterranean and in the Mediterranean, and wear at them, take them one by one, make them pull forces from northern France and from the Russian front, where the Russians were fighting 2/3 of the German army along that Russian combat area you can see in the upper right. And it was crucial that the Russians stay in the war and survive and continue to drain that German force. So the British plan is come up through the Mediterranean, pick our spots, bleed the Germans out, weaken them before we have any thought of crossing the channel, which is going to be the decisive campaign. Next, please. The great mediator at this conference who helped broker those two opposing views on both issues is Field Marshal Sir John Dill, photographed here. Probably the most respected, or certainly one of the most highly respected British officers or American officers at the senior end of command in World War II. Dill had been stationed in Washington as the key British emissary, if you will, on military affairs to the Americans, and went with the Americans to Casablanca for the conference, had formed a very deep friendship with Marshall, a real personal bond, and was respected and liked by the other senior Americans, and therefore was in a kind of unique position of being respected and admired by both sides across that conference table, and thereby able to help them broker the deal that they eventually made. Next, please. This is a photograph, I think it again speaks volumes. You've got Dill there on the right with his hands in his pockets talking to Brooke in a kind of a mentor fashion, which he was for Brooke. And then you've got Brooke with his hands on his hips in that kind of aggressive, oh no, I won't kind of posture, which is, I think, captures really what was going on between the two of them, with Brooke being obstinate and unbending and inflexible, and Dill working on him to get him to unbend and to compromise, which he eventually did. Next, please. This is an unsung hero of the conference, Sir John Coatsworth Slessor, a very high-ranking RAF officer who was at the meetings but did not participate. He was a staff officer, and he would sit there, take notes, watch what people were saying and doing, watch their faces, get a sense for the room, where things were going, where they weren't going. And it was he ultimately who came up with the essence of a compromise that carried the day at the conference. And again, we don't have time to get into depth on that in this short presentation, but the drift of it was that on the issue of how many resources go to the Asian War and how many go to the European War, the compromise was that the Americans would have a free hand in the Pacific to do what they thought best with the resources that were already there. So they could be confident of running that war as they chose to run it, but they would not be getting any more resources sent there beyond the levels that they already had. And in Europe, the compromise was that the Allies would follow the British plan, attack up through the Mediterranean, specifically taking Sicily first, and then moving on to the toe of Italy and up the boot. And after about a year of that kind of attack and draining of German power and strength in the Mediterranean, they would cross the channel in the spring of 1944. So a year and a half down the road. And that is in fact what, of course, happened as the war unfolded. Next, please. This is a shot of what was called a plenary session. There were 3 such sessions where all of the British and American military brass met in Roosevelt's villa in his Moroccan modern dining room, as you see here, 3 times during the conference, with Churchill as well. And you've got these absolute pinnacle of Allied military command sitting in that room for several hours, 3 times, talking through where they were in their negotiations, what remained to be resolved, how the bridge could be built between the 2 sides of the alliance, and generally forming that kind of special relationship between Britain and the United States that has prevailed all the way through our own time. Next, please. This is General Ira Eaker, and we're running low on time. I'll be brief. He was the commander of the 8th Air Force in Britain, the American 8th Air Force stationed in Britain, and was assigned by the Americans to try to persuade Churchill to let the Americans keep bombing the German military targets by day, as the British were bombing German cities by night. Churchill had wanted the Americans to stop this daylight bombing, which was costly in casualties, and join the British in the night bombing. Eaker convinced him to let the Americans keep doing what they were doing from their British bases, on the theory largely that we'll bomb them all day, you'll bomb them all night, they'll never get to bed, we'll keep them nervous and taut and strained the whole time. And Churchill takes the cigar out of his mouth, starts nodding his head and says, I like it. The devils will get no rest, which is where the title of the book comes from. Next, please. FDR rather insisted on making a personal inspection and tour of the major American army that was stationed in Algeria. This is a photograph of him reviewing those troops, who had no idea that Roosevelt was in Morocco, let alone that he would be coming there to boost their morale and the morale of the home front as well, with the newsreels and the letter writing and the still photographs that would inspire the home front, as it in fact did. Next, please. Here's Roosevelt in the center, his aide Harry Hopkins on his left, and Patton on his right, eating from mess kits with the field army next to a field kitchen. Next, please. This is a copy of a letter that FDR had sent to the parents of, and wives, if there were, of the soldiers that he had dealt with personally in Casablanca, who had either guarded his villa or served him meals or drove him around or in some way interacted with him personally. He signed letters like this to all of those family members. And the files I looked at in Hyde Park, his personal home's library, presidential library, contain some very moving responses from wives and mothers and girlfriends and brothers and sisters that, again, we don't have time to go into specifically, but the book does, and it's really quite moving. Next, please. Another quick take here. FDR invited the Sultan of Morocco to dinner at his villa while he was there. Behind the Sultan is the Sultan's son, the Crown Prince, and two of his advisors. And Churchill, of course, sits to FDR's left. The focal point of that dinner was Churchill sitting next to the Shah, who was under the wing of the French Empire, and telling the Shah, you know, within a few years after the war, your country is going to be independent. We're going to dismantle colonialism. We're going to give you American help to build your economy and be free of colonial domination, all of which was music to the Sultan's ears. And as you can already see in looking at that photo, anathema to Winston Churchill, the great imperialist, who fumed throughout that performance, did his best to change the subject and failed. And that in itself, that dinner and its trappings make an interesting subtext in the book also. Next, please. Quickly again, we have here Captain Louise Anderson, who was a member of what was called the Women's Auxiliary Army, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WACS, 5 of whom served at Casablanca as secretaries to FDR and to the high command. They had been torpedoed at night in December by German submarine when they were on their way to perform that service for Eisenhower in North Africa. And once FDR heard their story, he invited them to dinner at the Moroccan White House. I managed to track down the daughter of Captain Anderson, who provided me not only with this picture and some others, but also with her diaries and her letters, which are really a charming and very interesting insight into Roosevelt and his team off camera in their leisure time with these brave and important women officers. Next, please. Charles de Gaulle. We don't have time for Charles de Gaulle. He is got to be the most enormous ego in the history of the world, with the possible exception of his compatriot Napoleon, which dominates in the book from the Gaulle end of things. He was there, invited and almost pulled there by Churchill and FDR to confer with a rival French general named Charles Henri Giraud, who commanded different forces than de Gaulle did, and they had 2 different organizations. And the hope of the FDR and Churchill collaboration was to get them to join together and work together, which was a lot of what was worked on at Casablanca. Next, please. Here we see, second from the right, that General Giraud in the hands of his German captors. He was captured in 1940 and miraculously, almost at the age of 64, escaped from a castle prison rappelling down the outside walls at night in a thunderstorm with braided wire and bed sheets. So this is quite the character. Also at Casablanca, de Gaulle's big rival that Churchill and FDR managed to try to bring together at that meeting. Next, please. Here we have a photograph taken of the four of them at the closing press conference, once it was no longer secret. Giraud on the left and de Gaulle between Churchill and FDR. FDR managed to basically trick the two of them into a public handshake, having planted the thought in the eye of a photographer who was at the press conference to shout out, Mr. President, can we have a photograph of the two generals shaking hands? At which point FDR put his hands under their arms and sort of lifted them up. Next slide, please. Giving them no choice but to shake hands for this photograph that was promptly shown in every British and American newspaper on the front page. And as you can see, their distance is about as far apart as the laws of physics allowed, and to still have the handshake, but it did make the papers and made the point that FDR had wanted to make. Next, please. Here's a photograph, wide shot, taken of that press conference. And you can see Captain Anderson there at the middle top of the picture with their stenotype machine recording the transcript of that historic event. Next, please. A photograph of Captain Anderson with Churchill, which was given to me by her daughter, and under which she had written, "We're practically buddies by now." Next, please. Finally, we have a photograph of FDR and Churchill in Marrakech, to which Churchill had cajoled Eisenhower had cajoled FDR to come with him after the conference was closed for a couple of days of rest and recreation. You see them here up at the top of a minaret overlooking a stunning view of Marrakech. Now, after FDR went home the next day, Churchill went up to that tower with a paintbrush and his paint kit, very talented amateur painter, and produced a beautiful painting of that view, which he sent to FDR as a gift. Somehow, I don't know how, that painting eventually ended up in the hands of the actor Brad Pitt, who in turn gave it to Angelina Jolie, who in her turn auctioned it off after their divorce for $11.5 million. Next, please. So that brings us quickly, next, please. That brings us quickly to the end of the presentation. It's, as you can tell, and has to be, a very capsule summary of a very deep and complicated story, but I hope it conveys the essence. And if there's time, I would be glad to answer any questions or listen to any comments.
Okay, sounds great. We'll go ahead and start taking some questions. They're starting to roll in. So in a number of the pictures, FDR looked like he had a black armband on. Do you know what that is? What was that for?
Yeah, his mother had died. He was incredibly close to his mother. They had an extraordinarily close and personal relationship. She had died over a year before, and he still had that black armband on as a note of respect for her.
Okay. You talked a little bit about Admiral King. There's another individual, Cook, Savvy Cook, I think was his nickname. Can you talk about the dynamic between the two at the conference and maybe a little bit before?
Yeah, Savvy Cook was an admiral as well, but junior to Admiral King, and you know, probably his principal aide, and certainly his principal planner. If anything, the British thought that Savvy Cook was even more distasteful than Admiral King. They were cut from the same cloth, you know, the cliche about birds of a feather. And Cook, one of the British generals said that Cook's predecessor had been a tough customer, but he was bonhomie itself compared to Savvy Cook. So they made quite a difficult and demanding team at the conference.
Somebody has a comment about FDR. He looks to be, now, unfortunately, we know he passed away after getting elected for the fourth time. But before that, nobody knew that. He looked to be fairly in robust health. Was he relatively in good health at this point, or did he kind of keep anything secret from anybody?
Well, it was, you know, yes and no. I mean, he had contracted polio as a young man and had been paraplegic in a wheelchair ever since. So to that extent, his health was not what it would have been or should have been. But that said, he was not quite 61 at the time of the conference, still in generally good health, and really had not yet started that steep decline that hit him later. By the time he was reelected, he was really dying, and that had not been known to the public.
One of the generals I know a little bit about history, Bernard Montgomery, was he there? If not, why wasn't he there?
He was not there, and the reason for that is he was fighting Erwin Rommel in the desert in Tunisia, and the Afrika Korps and other German armies there. But so he was not there. But his commander, General Harold Alexander, flew in from Tunisia for the conference and described what was happening there, and played also a significant role there.
During the conference, Admiral King mentions enough of times, we don't have enough ships for an invasion. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but how do you calculate the number of landing crafts specifically to take an area? And let's not just say, France at this point. Let's say it's Operation Husky in Sicily. How do you know that? It's a tiny landmass, but is it based on how many divisions you have? What else you're going to bring in supplies-wise?
Well, candidly, that's beyond my expertise. I am not a military logician by any means, but I would have to leave that to the planners. But that was a very big issue in the conference, actually, because without landing craft, not only sufficient numbers of landing craft, but also of a type that are suitable to the beaches in Sicily, might very well be different than crossing the English Channel. In fact, it was very different. So there was a great logistical challenge there to manufacture landing craft and to get them across these, U-boat infested Atlantic to Europe, and to get others to the Pacific, and decide how many are going which place. So that's for brains much better than mine when it comes to that sort of thing.
You talked a lot about, of course, Japan, their big empire over there in the Pacific, the United States essentially having to sort of wait and fight on that. Did Britain offer any support whatsoever, or was it basically assumed that the United States is going to be fighting that kind of on their own?
Well, up until the time of this conference, the British had contributed some naval power to the Pacific War, but really very little, in part because the Japanese had smashed them just as badly on Pearl Harbor Day as they smashed us. I mean, Americans, I think, are not generally aware of that, but when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Hong Kong and Singapore and other British possessions, and took them very rapidly, and basically took most of the imperial possessions of not only the British, but the French and the Dutch as well, and really rolled them all over the continent within that wingspan that we looked at before.
So you mentioned the conference was 10 days. Was there a reason for that, or did they just kind of let everything sort of develop naturally?
Yeah, there wasn't that they went in saying we're going to be here for 10 days. It was just that that's how long it took. It was on the sort of outer edge of what they had budgeted for, if you will. But, when you're deciding issues that are going to win or lose World War II, 10 days is a pretty decent span to get that all worked out. The first half of it or so, they were arguing over strategy. The second half was a discussion and debate over tactics. How are we going to implement that strategy, and how are we going to get the weapons and the landing craft and the troops and the rest that we need to do that.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions. So somebody asked, you talked a little bit about General Eisenhower there, and I think at that point he wasn't a four-star general or whatever his rank was. He was a brigadier general. Is there a reason why he was picked to specifically go there at Casablanca?
Yeah, well, actually, when I said he was a brigadier general, that was earlier in his career, about a year before the conference. By the time of the conference, he was a three-star general, wanted to be a four-star general because a lot of the senior officers who reported to him as commander-in-chief of the theater outranked him. So, he wanted that other star, and Marshall wanted him to have it too. But FDR refused to give it to him until he had won some battles, as FDR put it. Eisenhower was at the conference. He was flown in for a couple of days to report on the fighting in Tunisia. And the long and the short of that is that given his military inexperience, he had never been in World War I on the ground and had never commanded combat troops in World War II. And the battle plan that he had designed for taking a major Tunisian port turned out to be amateur hour and was just taken apart by Brooke and the other British, kind of embarrassed Eisenhower. But the point is that, they were all inexperienced at that point, the American side, including Ike, and he was very young as well, relatively speaking. But over the time to come, he already had a lot of good political instincts, which served him well in his future, and very, very good at combining British and American officers in a cohesive staff unit and respected by both sides. So he grew into the job, and by the time he was commanding the invasion of France, he had reached a level that he had not yet reached at Casablanca.
Okay. So for our last question, there's of course the movie Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. So somebody's asking about, during this time, was FDR ever aware of anything going on with Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project and Trinity and all those things?
Oh, sure. He was all over that. He didn't obviously understand the physics, but he was kept very closely apprised of that project, knowing, as it turned out to be, it could be a decisive turning point in the war. And in fact, at Casablanca, a message was passed from Churchill to FDR that said something to the effect he wanted to learn more about tube alloys, which turned out to be the code word for atom bombs. So the conference took place very soon after the first successful test of an atom bomb took place, and it was not of a bomb itself, but of the technology that would make the bomb under a stadium in Chicago that had just taken place a few weeks earlier. And the bomb was not yet ready, but it was getting there, and that was part of what they were very hotly concerned about.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Conroy, for taking time out to talk about your wonderful book here, The Devil's Getting Over Us. So I hope the audience will enjoy that because it was a wonderful read.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, and good night to everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night.